On the American left, in the wake of the election that we just had, and this started on election night and indeed a couple of days before, you saw an argument start to manifest, and it was a very strange one. It took into account both the House and the Senate races, and people started asking some questions prior to the election, and it just ramped up afterwards. And what they were getting at was that the Democrats were very likely to receive more of what they called the popular congressional vote than their Republican counterparts, meaning to say there were going to be more human beings voting for Democrats than for Republicans. And we should compare that, I think the argument pushed us towards this, we should compare that to what the outcome of the election was broadly construed.
But the rules of the election...
Well, let's not get all the way to rules. Let's just start with the assertion here, because the assertion is a very, very strange one. I think it's necessarily tied to the rules, which is where you want to go with this, and I think you're right to. But what does it matter what the popular vote total is? And this is the same argument that you and I will offer every time there's a presidential election. The popular vote doesn't matter.
Right.
It just simply doesn't. And why doesn't it? Well, and here's the hard part for the people who are involved with this line of reasoning. Because we have a Constitution of the United States that specifies certain things, and then we have all kinds of other rules at the state level that specify certain things. If we're to follow those rules, and here you see the obvious bleed in with the idea of rules, if we're to follow those rules, then those are the rules that matter. Nothing else does. So you can make the case that a popular vote matters. The same way I could make a case that only people who wear green shirts should be allowed to declare anything.
But what you're arguing ultimately is that we should be operating under a different set of rules than we are. You're not arguing that we've somehow misapplied the rules.
No, that's exactly right. And I think if you peel back the layers on this one a little bit, there's a couple of good articles that get to the bottom of this, and we'll link them in the show notes. There was a professor who kind of came out and took the lead on this from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which is, by any estimation, a serious school with, filled with serious people. And he said that he couldn't quite understand how it could be that all these people would vote Democratic, and yet Democrats would not take the Senate.
Good Lord. I think 5 minutes with Wikipedia would answer his question.
Well, but it gets better than that because he's a political science professor.
My God!
So there you go. So he actually very much does understand why, because you can't get a PhD in political science and not understand why. Well, I mean, maybe you can, but it's almost impossible for me to imagine. I have been surprised by things like this before, though, so I'll leave it open as a possibility. But when enough people start asking a question, the hope is that it will trickle into the mainstream and regular people will start asking the same question, and it'll build up a head of steam of some kind that will alter things moving forward. So it's actually quite clear to me that all of these people, somehow or another, are taking their marching orders from a central location. There's just too many people making this asinine argument all at once for it not to have come from somewhere. Now, I'm not saying it's a conspiracy, but I'm saying somebody in the top of the pyramid scheme that is the American left decided, hey, I got an idea. Let's float this one out there. I bet our people will run with it. And lo and behold, they did.
So let's back up a minute. To someone who isn't paying too close of attention, it seems like a reasonable statement to say something like, well, over 50% of the people voted for this person, so this person should be the one who then takes office. And I think what's necessary is to take a step back and remind ourselves that we don't live in a democracy as much as we might use this word. We live in a republic. The founders were specifically afraid of democracy because you can easily get into a situation where 51% of the people decide they're going to take whatever they want from the other 49%. And so they constructed this republic precisely to prevent the majority from taking control.
Right. This is a feature, not a bug.
Yeah.
The American government is designed to work very slowly and very inefficiently. You have to just understand that before you walk in the door. So if that's the case, you start asking why. And the clear answer is provided in Federalist 51 by James Madison and in our recent episode on factions. So I would recommend that people go take a look at both of those things. But in brief, the idea is that in any self-governing body, you've got one massive problem on your horizon at every moment, and that's the problem of faction. And faction is always destructive, and it always operates to the detriment of the larger society. Now, sometimes factions are minority factions, and when they are, who cares? Because you could just vote them out of existence. They're silly. You don't really have to worry about them. Majority faction, on the other hand, that's a problem. And if people are free, you can't tell them what they're going to believe. So sooner or later, a majority faction will come into existence. And if that's true, and it is, the only thing you can do about it is to make government cumbersome by lengthening the period that it takes to take over a government simply. Which is why we have staggered elections. We have a 2-year House term, a 6-year Senate term, a 4-year presidential term. These groups have to get together, the president and the Senate, in order to get Supreme Court justices on the court, and on and on and on. So it's going to take a fair amount of time for any one group of people to take over the government. That's the design. Why? To keep majority faction from taking over the government, because you can't keep it from coming into existence. So when people say things like, Democrats got many more votes in all the Senate races combined than did Republicans, that's true. They did. It's everything that happens after the comma that becomes problematic. So when they say, comma, and therefore they should have a majority of the Senate seats, that's completely incorrect. What they're really doing is claiming that what we should be doing here, and notice it's a moral question for them, what we should be doing here is operating along the same lines as a parliamentary republic, the kind of which you find in Europe, where whoever gets 51% of the votes gets 51% of the seats, and now we're done and we just move on. And we didn't get that style of government here, largely because we had pre-existing states with state interests. We could have a discussion later, some other day, about whether we still have that to sufficient degree to warrant the kind of electoral politics we now have. But the rules of the game are clearly established. And here's the kicker. If we were to take the leftists seriously on these points and say, well, okay, you want to shake out the nationwide popular vote in such a way that the number of seats you get is perfectly reflective of the national vote. Well, the next step down that road, the step that they don't see for reasons I don't quite understand, is if you want to have a parliamentary system, the first thing you will get is a multiplicity of parties. Because when it's done by percentages, all of a sudden the Libertarians and the Greens and the Constitutional Party and the Natural Law Party, they all become players now.
There's something important I think people tend to overlook when they talk about the majority of voters, and that is that there's this huge divide in this country between urban and non-urban areas. Take my home state of Pennsylvania as an example. If you look at an electoral map, it's entirely Republican with the exception of a blue spot in Pittsburgh and a blue spot in Philadelphia. Now, having said that, Pennsylvania tends to vote Democrat. Now, how can that be? Well, it's because those two urban centers comprise most of the population of the state. If you look at a national map, it's the same kind of thing. You've got the New York area down to Washington, all blue. You've got the California coast, all blue. You've got some major centers like Chicago that's blue, but the rest of the map looks red. And what's going on here is that people who live in urban environments have decidedly different needs and different attitudes toward government than people in suburban or rural environments do. If we went with a parliamentary style government, what we would end up with is a government designed according to what the urban dwellers want.
What we ended up with at the time of the founding was two different understandings of representation. One based on population, one based on statehood. Not surprisingly, you get two very different answers when you ask people to choose, given that as the primary differentiator between them. The intellectual argument against what we now have, I think at heart you find some very strange kinds of things. And this argument, the one that they're offering now, is surely going to die a quick death because it's silly. But the factors that animate it, on the other hand, are probably with us for a while longer, because I think there are two. And I think they're so strange and they're so deeply felt on an emotive level that we probably aren't going to be able to shake them off. So I just want to run through the both of them in very short order. First, this business about the national vote. This just reeks of a forthcoming assault on the Electoral College. Because really what you've got here is an argument that says the rules don't matter, only the numbers matter. And people don't realize that the numbers emerge in no small part because of the rules. And to give you a quick example, what sense would it have made for Donald Trump to campaign in California literally at all?
None. There's no way he was going to win that state.
Not going to win the state. So would you spend $1 of your precious limited resources going there? Only if you're crazy. So what are you doing? You're conceding the state, which I think was the wise choice. What does that mean? A bunch of people who could have been prevailed upon to vote for you won't. What does that mean? That means the delta between Clinton's total and Trump's total is going to be bigger than it otherwise would have been.
Right, because he didn't try at all.
Because he didn't try at all. Now, if he knew that somehow losing but getting as many votes as possible was important, he would have behaved very differently. But it wasn't important, so he just wrote it off. And when people make the argument that Hillary Clinton got 3 million more votes than Donald Trump, well, who cares? The rules defined his behavior defined the outcome. If we had different rules, I don't know what the vote totals would have been, but they wouldn't have been what we got.
Right.
And that's the trap people keep walking into. So when you start looking at this nonsensical argument about a national vote total in races that are not national, it doesn't matter.